My name is Ryan, and this is Grace, and I'll be your host for this evening. Before we introduce our speaker, I will speak briefly about the IID. The International Issues Discussion Series was founded in 2005 by two Ryerson students and two faculty members, one of whom was Dr. Arcus Like of the Department of History. Since its inception, the IID has hosted a number of lectures with speakers from around the world. Some of our past lectures include the US government's secret doomsday plans and Europe on the brink.
Our guest this evening is Michael Signer, the current mayor of Charlottesville, Virginia, the scene of racist, anti-Semitic, and ultra-nationalist violence this past August that undermined the credibility of the Trump presidency. He's also a lecturer at the University of Virginia and the general counsel of a major Charlottesville-based technology firm. He previously served as counsel to the governor of Virginia, as the national security director of the John Edwards 2008 presidential campaign, and as a senior policy advisor at the Center for American Progress. Signer is also the author of Demagogue, The Fight to Save Democracy from Its Worst Enemies, and Becoming Madison, The Extraordinary Origins of the Least Likely Founding Father. His writing has appeared in numerous media, and he has been interviewed or profiled by numerous major TV networks. He holds a Ph.D. in political science from UC Berkeley, a J.D. from the University of Virginia School of Law, and a B.A. in politics, magna cum laude, from Princeton University.
Please help us welcome Michael Signer.
All right, well, thank you very much for the generous introduction. I have really enjoyed my time here so far. I want to thank Arn for such a generous day. A little bit packed. I've done more media today in your media market than I think I've done in my media market for, which has been really an experience because I wasn't entirely sure what to expect, but it seems that exactly what you said in extending the invitation to come, that there is a great deal of compassionate concern among here in this city, our neighbors to the north, about what happened in Charlottesville. And it's been extremely interesting to hear and to listen to those concerns and those reactions. I will confess that, you know, these events are only 4 months away now, and I think a lot of us have been so engaged locally and so kind of burrowed in that I haven't had the luxury of taking that much time to think about what is the perception from in other arenas. And it's very important because I do know that these events did resonate nationally, internationally. I knew that because we heard about it directly, but this is the first foreign visit that I've done to here, and it really is very meaningful. And I'm looking forward to the Q&A that'll happen after this. So thank you very much. It's been really quite a day so far. So I want to begin by telling you a little bit about Charlottesville, setting the scene, and then we'll get into some of the events that happen and what I think they mean. How many people here have been to Charlottesville, Virginia? See, isn't that great? And that happens almost anywhere I go. Usually in America, virtually anywhere I do go, it's like 75% of people will have been to Charlottesville. So a few facts. We are a city of 50,000 people. That surprises people because we sort of have an outsized reputation. We're surrounded by Albemarle County. In Virginia, cities and counties are separate, which also surprises a lot of people, but we have a very close partnership with this county that surrounds us, which has 120,000. A lot of their addresses are also Charlottesville rather than Albemarle County, so we're an area of a little bit under 200,000 people. We are AAA bond rated, so our fisc is very strong. We have 700 nonprofits in the area. We have an extremely strong civil society, strong social entrepreneurship culture. A lot of people are starting do-gooder organizations and making a living doing that in Charlottesville. We have a robust creative economy. We have associations both of biotech and renewable energy firms that were just launched in the last couple of years. So innovation and a creative economy are key to our success. And one of the points of success is that we have the lowest unemployment of any city in Virginia. And I think that the diversity and tolerance in civil society are key to that. We're the home to the University of Virginia, which is one of the world's great universities. They're really enmeshed in the city and county culture. A lot of people, there's been an old saying about Charlottesville, which is we're called the Hook. There was actually an alternative magazine that had that as the name. It was called The Hook. And that was because you would come to Charlottesville to go to school at UVA, or you would go to a wedding. We're the #2 wedding destination. And you would get hooked, and you would somehow find it itching at you, and you would relocate your life to live in Charlottesville. And that is exactly what happened to me. I went to law school at UVA, moved away, then came back after a time and wanted to reorganize our lives to live there. We are also, I've been learning a lot in Toronto today about the diversity here and the diversity at the university. We pride ourselves on international diversity and on religious toleration. We have a major office of the International Rescue Committee in Charlottesville, which brings, I think last year was 120 political refugees, most from Muslim countries. That is woven into the fabric of our community. We value and pride the fact that we are a haven for people fleeing tyranny in these other countries. And that also invites, obviously, not just cultural toleration, but religious toleration. And that is an article of, that's a principle in this community that we value and respect, the fact that we do have these folks who become our neighbors and our students and our colleagues. We're also very progressive. Charlottesville voted for Bernie Sanders over Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary, for instance. There's a lot of other points of proof about the progressivism of the city. But the reason I'm telling you all these things is that the images that the world saw of Charlottesville immediately in the wake of this really horrible, it's been a bad year. There were a couple of different events leading up to August 11th and 12th. I continually hear, well, Charlottesville now, the image that I have of Charlottesville has become a meme or a hashtag for these violent images. And the reason that I want to tell you about Charlottesville and who we actually are is that I don't believe that those images can or should or will ultimately replace the true actuality of what Charlottesville is. Charlottesville is the city that I just told you about. We became a target for these invaders coming from outside the city, from 31 other states, precisely because we are this sort of city that has this sort of culture and these sorts of values. And we will continue to be that sort of city with those sorts of values, I believe, even more strongly going forward as a result of this terrible event. Let me just tell you, just again, to set the scene just a little bit about the work of the mayor in our form of government, the work of the city council. We have a part-time citizen legislator form of government in Virginia. What that means, it goes back to the progressive era when they tried to professionalize city government. So we have a city manager form of government. The city council is theoretically part-time. The mayor is selected from within the city council as the chair of that governing body for the city. Our job is to make policy, is to pass the budget, is to be the primary interface with the public. We kind of adjudicate disputes. We are the final board of appeal for things like zoning disputes. And we make policies. So some of the things that just in this last couple of years, to give you a sense of what we do other than Confederate statues, we'll get to that in a minute. I came into office on a platform of one Charlottesville. So it was to think about what could unify and bridge divides within the city. The 5 priorities that I wanted to work on were equity, reconciliation, innovation, governance, and infrastructure. Equity, we are a city that is increasingly prosperous, that is in demand, as a lot of in America, probably as in Canada, there's been a movement back to cities. A massive demographic change with people not wanting to live in large tracts out in the suburbs. We've experienced that to a degree that has been pretty intense. Our population has gone up 12% in 6 years. Property prices are going up. Everything is going up. It's a position that a lot of cities would would die to be in, but it creates a lot of problems, such as increasing housing costs, affordable housing crisis. So we doubled our spending on affordable housing at the beginning of this year to the tune of almost $10 million. We've increased funding to public schools. We did a tax cut for small businesses that make between $50,000 and $100,000, which was an important. There were over 400. On reconciliation, I'll talk a little bit more about this, but it's been very important to try and bridge some divides on these issues around race and class and gentrification. And we've stopped some rezoning projects that could have really hurt the city. We created a position about black male achievement, which mirrors a program that President Obama started. On innovation, we expanded our technology tax credit. We implemented an open data policy for the city, so it sort of opened up all of our data for all these millennials to hack to their heart's content, which is about as much as I know about it, other than it was my initiative, and I thought that was great to let other people kind of set sail with it. On infrastructure, we've done a major bridge is coming in. We're redeveloping an abandoned hotel, and the main street that connects the university and the downtown mall is going to be redeveloped to expand bike lanes and to quadruple the tree canopy and to underground the utilities and do lots of other good things. So that's just the work, kind of the mainstream bulk of work of the city council. But the kind of, there is a dark side to some of the progress and the prosperity in Charlottesville. You could even describe it as two Charlottesvilles. We have a poverty problem in the city. We have a poverty rate that's about twice the rate of peer cities in Virginia. That could be attributed to systemic racism, certainly in the past, to redlining, to residential discrimination, to the fact that the University of Virginia, which is the largest employer in our area, pays very low wages, and a lot of folks have no option but to work as a nurse assistant or in groundskeeping or some other job there, but you're really kind of locked into very low wages, but you also live in the city. And those predominantly affect minority populations that are taking those jobs, if they even have those jobs. You have a mesh of race and class that has created an underclass in Charlottesville, and that problem has become increasingly painful and evident to a lot of residents of Charlottesville, black and white, rich and poor, as the economic boat has lifted but not lifted, the tide has not lifted everyone. We also have a past that has some very prominent patterns of systemic racism within it, and institutional racism and white supremacy, which has been interesting for us because as a progressive southern city, we have been increasingly politically progressive over the last decades. The leadership of the city and the political groupings of the city have increasingly wanted to come to terms with the past. What I'd like to suggest to you is that the same dynamic, creative city that is the city that I told you about, it was a good thing that we started the project of a progressive southern city of lifting the veil and telling the full truth of race in our past. But that is what made us a target for these outside groups that didn't want that project started at all. So a number of years ago, Charlottesville made the decision to launch a project, this is before I was on city council, called the Dialogue on Race. It was actually just restarted for this fall, but that was a citywide series of curated, moderated conversations among citizens about race, with readings and discussion groups. It's very diverse, and it was also meant to generate a policy agenda for what the city could do to start to work on race. It directly led to a number of initiatives that were implemented. We started an Office on Human Rights. There was support for ex-offenders, programs to help them come back into society and help them come back into the economy, a number of other projects like that. About a year and a half ago, this coincided with me coming on to council. Two of my colleagues started a new initiative, which was a protest of a Confederate general statue that had been installed in the downtown area of Charlottesville in the Jim Crow era, so in the 1920s, not right after the Civil War, but in the 1920s. This is very common around the American South. About 30, 40, 50 years after the end of the Civil War, there was a push along with what's called the lost cause narrative, where there was the Daughters of the Confederacy, which is a group, and a number of others, really started a program to install these monuments in public areas around the South to kind of change the public history that was associated with the South losing the Civil War, and many other things. So these had kind of stood without much controversy for many years. There had been a little bit around them, but in the spring of 2016, there was a real push to move the statue of Robert E. Lee from a block away from downtown Charlottesville. There was existing a Virginia statute that prevents the, quote, removal or disturbance with war memorials that had been passed many years ago. Virginia is also an anti-home rule state, so localities in Virginia, cities and counties, have no power to do anything that they have not been permitted to do by the legislature sitting in Richmond. So that's called Dillon's rule. You'll be sued, and anything you do will be struck down by a judge because we have the opposite of home rule. So that's an important thing to know about Virginia. So there was this push started to move the statue of Robert E. Lee. That was a controversy that persisted through the present day. But what City Council did was to say, we don't want this to just be about the Robert E. Lee statue. Let's have a bigger conversation and a bigger project about race in Charlottesville entirely in our public spaces. So we created what was called the Blue Ribbon Commission on Race Memorials in Public Spaces. It was, we appointed 9 citizen members to this commission. They were majority African American, and we charged them with the following: to advise City Council on changing the narrative in Charlottesville by telling the full story of race through public spaces. They were directed to examine not only the 2 statues, actually, to Confederate generals, but about a dozen aspects of Charlottesville, the southern city, that deal with race. There were some that were purely controversial and negative, like the general statues, but there were other aspects that that are more mixed. There was a historic African-American cemetery called the Daughters of Zion Cemetery that had been built by a benevolent women's association that was where the black middle class in Charlottesville was buried at the turn of the last century, that had fallen into disrepair, that was a block off the downtown mall. There was something called the Bridge Builders Award, where this key bridge that connects the university and the downtown mall, there had been an award that had been existing for many years where people who built bridges between the races in Charlottesville were recognized, and they were given a plaque and an inscription, but that had sort of fallen into disrepair also, and so bringing that back, and how do we attend to this? There was an urban renewal project where a black commercial and residential neighborhood was erased under the argument that it was a blighted kind of slum area, but it was raised, and you had the key commercial area of Charlottesville's black population was decimated. The population was relocated to public housing, and the site sat bare for many years afterward until it was redeveloped into a shopping center with a parking lot. Those injuries are still very raw. And how do we deal with those injuries? What's the memorial to them? What's the recognition with them? So these were among the charges that we gave to this commission. It was really opening the aperture of the problem and saying it's not just about a statue. There's a bigger landscape here that we're addressing, and we really want to come to terms with and change the city. So the Blue Ribbon Commission met for 6 months. They had 17 public hearings. They gave us an exhaustive, very thoughtful report, and we ended up acting on, I think, virtually every one of their recommendations, such as we have an African American Heritage Center that was financially troubled that does an immense amount of programming. We gave them almost $1 million in new funding, for instance. And we did a whole host of other things. They gave us a bunch of recommendations related to these statues that we also started acting on. We changed the names of the parks from Lee Park and Jackson Park to respectively Emancipation Park and Justice Park. We removed a plaque that described Lee as among the heroes of the Confederacy, and just got rid of it. We said that we committed to overhauling the parks entirely and redoing the landscaping and putting in new monuments that would rebut what these statues, even if we couldn't move them legally, it would rebut what they stood for and tell a new story about the values that Charlottesville does stand for, and tell the truth about the history behind locality's decision to put in Confederate general statues in the 1920s. What is that about? So that people know the truth. It was that work by a progressive southern city trying to come to terms with the past in the South that made us a target for everyone who invaded us on August 12th. Because they did not want to change the narrative, and they did not want the full story told about race in this country. Remember, what they wanted was embodied in this slogan, "Make America Great Again," which means that everything in that idea of greatness already has been established. There is no more work to be done. We must return to the past, and the narrative does not need to be changed, and we don't need to achieve some new standard. And there is a disagreement about that, and we saw it play out on the streets of Charlottesville. There's some more events this year that you may not know about, but that, with the long lens view that I have, everything that happened leading up to the 12th, there was a momentum to it. So in May, I was at home when I got a text of a photo. And I couldn't, when I just saw it on my phone, it seemed beyond belief. And it was about 100 people at the then named Lee Park who were standing in white shirts and khakis with tiki torches all together in a display of something. And then earlier that day, there had been what was called the Festival of Cultures, which we do every year, which is basically a celebration of the same cultural diversity that you guys have here, which we love, and it's in Lee Park. And there had been this sort of threatening march past the Festival of Cultures by the same group that appeared that night, that this gentleman, Richard Spencer, some of you might have heard his name. He's a University of Virginia graduate. He invented the term alt-right. And had a rally soon after Trump was sworn in as president in Washington at a hotel where people were doing Hitler salutes, and they had buzz cuts, and there was a lot of talk, white nationalism, and these slogans, blood and soil, you will not replace us, that there's now been a lot more attention to. So he had a band of supporters follow him into Charlottesville with the intent of making some sort of stand, and that night, this kind of spectacular display of intimidation did race around the world. I did a statement where I said that we're a welcoming city, but such hatred is not welcome here. This display of visual intimidation beckons back to the days of the KKK. And that statement raced around the globe. I didn't expect it to, but there was something about the image and how startling and frightening this was in this time, in the Trump era. How could people feel comfortable and confident to do something like this in a town like Charlottesville? And he expressly said that it was the work that we were doing around issues like Confederate statues that made us a staging ground for this alt-right spectacle. That was the precursor. All of the controversy that happened in that first event was the precursor to then what happened in July. We got a notice, I believe it was early June, that the KKK had applied for a permit for an event in Charlottesville. It turned out that my first reaction was there's still a KKK. It turned out that this is, I'm not making light in any other way other than to try and give the full perspective on this, but the KKK as such is highly fragmented and broken up in the United States today. This was a rump group of sort of knockoff KKK which was based out of North Carolina, calling themselves the Loyal Knights of the Ku Klux Klan. Ultimately, what happened was about 40 of these people drove from North Carolina up to Charlottesville, went to Lee Park with the intent of creating an intimidating spectacle, getting their names in the paper, and contributing to this ongoing controversy in this very famous, progressive, attractive, welcoming city that had decided to work on these issues. That became a very famous event. There were, I worked very hard with many leaders in the city and the police chief, the university, to set up a number of alternative events called Unity Seville, which were meant to give an alternative to folks with the idea of taking this bait might not be the best idea, but there were 1,000 people, and I was very proud to see them show up, even if I still thought that it might not be the best idea to go confront these criminals, in many cases, right in person. 1,000 people went and very proudly and strongly confronted the KKK and surrounded them and, chanted and prayed and gave a visual spectacle that Charlottesville was a city that wasn't going to stand for this hatred in our public. So you had a lot happening in the city that day. That event was a very striking one in the city's history. And that set the stage for what happened on August 11th and 12th, which you all know about, where there was a Unite the Right event all around the country, these various threads and fragments of all these extreme votes, organizations that my take on this is that these groups were always in the shadows in American politics. You had the John Birch Society, you've had the KKK, you've had separatists, you've had militia movements, you've had racist biker gangs, you've had a lot of these different organizations, but there really was a devil's bargain that the Trump campaign and Breitbart News and the nascent alt-right movement struck with these forces. It was a base political strategy to intensify enthusiasm and turnout politically, and there was a bargain struck and it was a strategy, and you saw it on full display with this Unite the Right rally. The reason that we in the city were so worried about what was going to happen was not just the rhetoric and not just the experience of these other events happening. The intent of the organizers and the people who were going to come to this event was that this was going to be alt-right 2.0. They said this was going to be the moment that the world sees our movement and really reckons with us for who we are. There was this competition in the iconography around this event online that was really frightening to behold. There were competitions for like the one image with flaming crosses or Nazi eagles swooping around this Lee statue with shadows and soldiers, and there were dozens and dozens of these, and each one was more visually compelling and more provocative than the last one, and there was a kind of mounting intensity around attending the Unite the Right rally by all these different groups that, again, previously had never had the confidence or the invitation to come into the mainstream of American political life. An invitation I believe they were given by the alt-right movement, by the Trump campaign, by the various other intentional decisions that were happening in that political moment. And we saw it come to light in Charlottesville. So what happened at that event you all saw. You saw, again, this was not just on August 12th, which was a Saturday. The night before August 11th was the first event, which was an invasion of the grounds. They're called grounds, not campus, at the University of Virginia. Thomas Jefferson's treasured lawn, which connects the rotunda to this unnamed field, which is also very famous. These people came with tiki torches, and several hundred of them staged a march shouting things like, anybody seen the Vice News documentary, which now is so famous, shouting, "Jews will not replace us," instead of "you will not replace us," using open racial epithets, chanting blood and soil, which is a Nazi slogan. Russia is our friend, which was another thing that they had said. One of the most weird things about all this. Gets a little less weird. I'll tell you a little bit more. But they did this on the grounds of the University of Virginia. And a group of students very courageously sort of gathered around the statue to Thomas Jefferson and protected it from them. There was open fist fighting and attacks. The university was taken by surprise by this in some ways. There's a lot of investigation that's happening now about this. But and that was the day before the invasion of the city itself. And it was as shocking and as unspeakable as any of you could imagine. And then think about it from the perspective of us in the city. We had tried with the city leadership very hard that week to stop the rally from coming to downtown Charlottesville. The First Amendment in the United States is extremely rigorous and demanding of localities with public free speech events. A lot of the law that we have was handed down by the ACLU going to the Supreme Court and defending groups like the KKK's ability to appear in public. So there's a famous book, Nazis in Skokie, which talks about Nazis being allowed to march in a town with Holocaust survivors in the town of Skokie. The test that we have in the United States, I don't know if it's similar in Canada, is falling short of an imminent incitement to unlawful action, which means somebody basically shouting fire in a crowded theater saying go riot now. It is very difficult for a locality to stop an event where disagreeable or offensive speech is going to happen. And in fact, the disagreeable or offensive speech a lot of time is overtly protected by the courts. So that was all the backdrop of the First Amendment law that we were dealing with, but we tried to move the rally to a more remote location within the city of Charlottesville where there would have been a lot more green space and would have been in crowded downtown Charlottesville with things like cars and crowds of pedestrians. And a decision was made to relocate the rally on the Monday before the event. And a federal judge, the ACLU sued us, taking the side of the organizer of the event, saying that this was not content neutral, our decision to move the event. And then the night before, on Friday night at like 8 o'clock, a federal judge ruled against us, ruling that the event had to happen in downtown Charlottesville in the park with the Lee statue, which is a block off the downtown mall. Part of the backdrop here. So when it happened, the event itself, it barely got started. Before the scheduled time of all these speeches by all these celebrities in this dark world of the alt-right, they were all going to come and speak and share their opinions about immigration and Confederate history and white nationalism. There was so much violence in the streets, so much intent to mayhem and street fighting that happened that an unlawful assembly was declared before the starting time of the event, and then a state of emergency by the governor. And then everything that you saw on TV unfolded after that. The car attack by the alleged terrorist, which killed Heather Heyer and injured 19 others, happened a couple hours after that. And you basically had a city that was converted into a war zone by people who came from 31 other states to attack a progressive city and to try and make a show that they were now welcome. This was alt-right 2.0. This was the moment they would be heard in the world. This was the moment their movement would take root and become a legitimate force. So the question now is, what actually happened? What was the significance of what happened on August 12th for the country? I have a stance that might surprise some of you on this, which is a kind of tempered or steely optimism about where we ultimately do go from this horrible experience that we have been through. And I'm coming from a city which has been literally traumatized. There was a trauma education and training event that just happened a couple days ago. 700 people came to the city. You have hundreds of people who witnessed, not just experienced the physical trauma of being physically injured or assaulted. Thank you, President. See you later. Nice to have you here with us. We had a nice meeting earlier on. there were people who had verbal abuse inflicted upon them, or what? I mean, just the experience of seeing a Nazi flag paraded in front of you with these shields and these batons and the headgear that these people were wearing when they were ready for battle. You have a traumatized city, a city that is desperate for healing, that is working for healing. But I'm still optimistic about where we all will go from this. And from there, I want to tell you a little bit about where my optimism comes from. So I'm the author, it was alluded to in the introduction, I'm the author of 2 books, and I have a history of working and studying on democracy, particularly in a time of threat. I wrote my doctoral dissertation in Berkeley on demagogues and democracy. Democracy, which is really ironic to have stumbled, I know. You couldn't have, it's really, when you say it like that, it does seem really, it is really strange that I ended up in this position. When I was, I started the Ph.D. when I was 24, and I got, after about a year, I had been transfixed by what happened in Weimar Germany, where you had a hopeful, optimistic constitutional democracy become taken over from within and turn into a demagogue-led, murderous tyranny. And that puzzle of how could freedom become its opposite through freedom really haunted me. And as I started digging into this problem, it turns out that this is something that has been studied for thousands of years. So the ancients called it a cycle of regimes. I'll read you a couple of quotes here. Plato said that democracy's insatiable desire for what it defines as the good is also what destroys it. In Rome, Polybius said that this is when rule disintegrates into its base forms. The demagogue is sufficiently ambitious and daring to serve as both a master and a despot of the people. There's a 4-part definition. I was really amazed today. There were like 2 or 3 people who had read my book, Demagogue, which came out in 2009. Between us had sort of a fallow period for a few years. But I did not really, here I am in Toronto, and there's like 5 people who at least claim to have read it. It might just be that very nice, flattering thing that you all do. But I'm going to tell my wife that everybody in Canada is reading my book. So there's a 4-part test that I put together in this book for a demagogue. They posture as a mirror of the masses, usually attacking elites. They trigger great waves of emotion. They use that emotion for political benefit, and they threaten or break established rules of governance. When you put those 4 components together, you get a political figure who creates a state within the state that is accountable only to them, that they control. And the real turn happens when that sub-state within the state takes over the state. And that's what the ancients were referring to with the cycle of regimes. They talked about how a democracy would become a tyranny through the demagogue. The tyranny sometimes would be overthrown by a group of noblemen. It would become an oligarchy, and the oligarchy would be overthrown by the people, and then the cycle would begin again. At its deepest level, this whole question opens up a fundamental question about optimism or pessimism, because if you believe that we're going to be stuck in the cycle of regimes, you believe history is flat and we actually can't self-improve, and the demagogue is a demon that we're stuck with, and we really have no hope but to either outlast or check the demagogue who preys on our prejudices, but there really is no transcending the demagogue. If, on the other hand, you have an optimistic view of history, and history we can move and we can self-improve and we can learn, then there's a totally different answer to the problem of the demagogue, which is the people can solve it themselves through learning and through understanding enough to deny the demagogue the fallow ground they seek, which is the ability basically to tap into our prejudices and manipulate us for their own benefit. That second part is the answer that the American founding fathers had. The demagogues are everywhere in the beginning of the American Republic. They're in the first and the last pages of the Federalist Papers. They are mentioned frequently on the floor of the Constitutional Convention. There was a demagogue named Daniel Shays who led a rebellion of debtors in Massachusetts in 1786 before the Constitutional Convention. So they were very alert to this problem, and what they resolved was the same answer that Athens had come to 2,000 years before, which was the people ultimately were their own answer to demagogues. If the people developed a culture which would deny the demagogue the vulnerability that they depended on, if you and I, everybody said we are going to be more alert and self-disciplined and tough-minded and scrutinizing of anybody who would prey on us, and we would develop institutions and a whole culture around those values, then the demagogue won't have any, there will be nothing for them to prey on. That's what constitutionalism is. You go back to your Politics 101, Alexis de Tocqueville, when he visited the United States in the 1830s, this is what he wrote about. He documented our mores. He documented the culture that was enabling the United States to have a healthy democracy. Democracy, when it took its first run through Europe, it ended in the cycle of regimes. The democracy in France quickly became a self-consuming tyranny, and then it was an emperorship right away. So that was the question is, how do you stabilize democracy so it can actually improve over time rather than just repeat the cycle of violence and self-destruction? He thought that our culture of values, our norms, where we cared about the health of the democracy, where regular people thought about the balance of powers, thought about authoritarianism, thought about freedom, thought about toleration, thought about pluralism, about deliberation, about facts, about achieving results through collective action, about statesmanship. He thought that that culture was the answer to why we were succeeding, why demagogues had not destroyed America yet, 50 years into our founding. And that's the argument of my book, Demagogue, is that that is the ultimate answer to demagogues. It's not formal checks and balances, it's not institutions. They're very important, but it's the people themselves and the culture that they develop that is the answer. Madison wrote, he described the vigilant and manly spirit which actuates the people of America, a spirit which nourishes freedom and in turn is nourished by it. That's the culture we have. That is America's success. And I have a bullish take on how we have arrived at this point in our history. We have had a number of stress tests that have questioned that constitutionalism and its viability. We had McCarthyism, which was a 3-year period of time when the country did seem to be turning on itself, seemed to be self-destructing, and the very values that bolster our constitutionalism were being sacrificed, basically, on the altar of this anti-communist nationalism. But the nation recovered. We had Jim Crow, not just the Reconstruction era, but a whole host of de jure discriminations in law which were viciously oppressive toward a minority in the southern states. It was a horrific period in our time. We're still dealing with it, but the nation ultimately did find within itself, through culture, through our rules and our norms and our aspirations, a repudiation of that formal discrimination. We are still dealing with it, but we did reject it and move past it from within America's own ideals. And that is that dynamic, that internal struggle that does move upward is constitutionalism. That is the heart of the American democratic experiment. So my belief is that will happen today, but we have, before I get to the proof points of my optimism and where we need to go, there is real cause for concern. And I don't mean to paint a Pollyannish picture. There is I'll point you for one example of this article in the Journal of Democracy called The Danger of Deconsolidation that appeared in July of 2016. What's supposed to happen in a healthy democracy is you consolidate over time. You get better. Just like a citizen or like a student. You get better. You get smarter over time. That's what's supposed to happen. There has been an alarming trend where these democracies are, instead of consolidating, they're deconsolidating. You saw it in Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, where the country started to fall apart into its parts under the pressure of a demagogue. And these two scholars are finding the same thing in the United States. And especially among millennials, guys, especially among young people, that's where the most worrisome public opinion findings are, is that you're seeing a dramatic fall off in the constitutional, in these norms, and in the cultural commitments that are, if you believe me, they are the antidote to the demagogue. So they found that, for instance, those saying it was unimportant to freely choose leaders through free elections, only 10% of older people said that, baby boomers and older, but 26% of millennials in America said that. For the proposition that the military should never be able to take over civil government, 43% of older people said that, baby boomers and beyond. Only 19% of millennials did. And support for a strong leader without elections themselves. In 1995, 24% of the population said that they could support that. In 2011, so before Trump, 32% did. This is very concerning because it is what leads you to see how can there be this 36%, 35% that keeps on supporting this president despite everything that we have seen. And this is not a partisan argument. This is not a political argument. You can make this argument whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. This is just an empirical argument about a style of governance and a commitment to basic principles about constitutional practice that's really worrisome. And you start to see the ingredients here, which is why this fight and what Charlottesville comes to mean is so crucially important, and why it depends on what everybody, we're in Canada right now, but it really depends on what people in America are going to do with their day-to-day lives. So here's the case for optimism. Took me a while to get here, but we just had these unbelievable elections in Virginia 2 weeks ago, where there were 3 weeks. There was a election. Well, wait. What? It's almost. Yeah, it's 3 weeks ago now. There was a whole election cycle that was prosecuted basically about what happened in Charlottesville. There were a lot of other issues, but the Republican candidate Ed Gillespie ran a campaign on the core issues of Trumpism. It was about immigration. It was about Confederate statues. And there was this kind of angry, nasty divisiveness underneath it that you could also say is core to this whole political mood that this Trumpism taps into. His opponent, Ralph Northam, was running a campaign about economic progress, about diversity, about innovation, about creativity. He actually said that he thought that all the Confederate statues should be moved, which was a position way far to the left of a lot of people. And he, underneath this whole political season, you had you had very intense trench warfare between the two political parties and all these different groups trying to make Virginia their own. You had this Republican gubernatorial candidate named Corey Stewart, who almost unseated Ed Gillespie, who was the front runner for a long time, running a campaign entirely about Charlottesville and Confederate monuments. His entire campaign was and there's this New Yorker article that just came out yesterday, front page, when white power came to Charlottesville, and they focus some on Corey Stewart, who ran this campaign about Charlottesville, and he came within 1 point of unseating Ed Gillespie for the Republican nomination for governor, running a campaign that was entirely about the Confederate past and stoking white nationalist anger about these projects of changing the narrative by telling the full story about race in our history. So you had that backdrop in politically. So and he had a 15-point jump above what the polls were predicting. So nobody knew what to expect. And Ralph Northam, who was also a pretty calm, moderate person, he's a he's a youth neurophysician. He does brain surgery on kids. He was a veteran. He won by 9 points. There was the largest voter turnout we'd seen in a very long time. And in the Virginia House of Delegates, you had 17 or 18 Democratic candidates win in a legislative map that has been redistricted and gerrymandered to protect a Republican majority that had been 68-32. So it was this tsunami of the resistance, of a activist movement by regular people giving voice, giving dollars, showing up, supporting activist groups. There were all these pop-up groups. The New York Times Magazine had an article last week about what happened in Virginia, where they went to Loudoun County and they documented this wave of activism. And what I want to tell you is all of that depended on agency. It depended on people deciding to do something. And I saw it every day in Charlottesville. There was nothing kind of systemic. There was no wave that was happening around people. It was people like you all deciding to do something different as a result of what they were seeing. And all that action that was voluntary and then was based on an idea of what America was and what democracy was had a massive change. And I would connect that with the so-called resistance movement that has been all around the country, with the action that has been happening in the courts and among lawyers to stop a lot of this nonsense, like the various iterations of the Muslim ban. And I would connect it to what's been happening with the free press in the United States and to what's happening in Congress, whether through incompetence or inaction or whatever. They have refused to implement a lot of the worst parts of the Trump agenda. So you have a very active, vigorous battle right now within this dynamic, resilient democracy for the future. And I think a lot of it goes back to everything being unveiled in Charlottesville as it was on August 12th. I was interviewed a couple days ago in my office by an Argentinian journalist who's with CNN Argentina, and he said this most powerful thing. He said, if any country in the United States, in any country in the world can overcome authoritarianism through democracy, it's the United States. And that's exactly what I want to suggest to you, but it is not going to happen on its own. There is no confidence or complacency or even prediction you can make. It doesn't get to happen by you predicting it or being optimistic about it. It is only going to happen because millions of people wake up and decide to do something with their lives that is different in response to what they are seeing. And that's how what just happened. So I usually end these talks, with these old truisms that do go to the heart of a lot of American political theology, I guess. But FDR said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, and I do believe that. The danger of fear, like in Charlottesville right now, and that's why I want to contest this image of what everybody thinks Charlottesville means. It's going to come to mean how we overcame this threat. It is not going to be defined by these people who invaded us. But there is a concern here. I'm Jewish, so we can talk about it in this Q&A. I've received immense amounts of anti-Semitic threats that are just vicious and virulent. A lot of African Americans in Charlottesville have been worried. Is this a comfortable home for them? Do they apply to the University of Virginia? Are Jews welcome in Charlottesville? They have to be. You have to commit to the pluralism and tolerance of a city that is welcoming, that is progressive, and not let this predatory, invading kind of behavior define us or frighten us. So the only thing we do have to fear is fear itself. And the final thing, which I just believe in every fiber of my being, is there is nothing that is wrong with us that what's right with us can't fix in the United States. That is the ultimate lesson of how we've gotten where we are, as injured, as raw, as challenging, as traumatized as we are going to be better than we were even before this. It is going to take a ton of work, but it's going to come from within the internal DNA that already has gotten us to where we are as the United States of America. Thank you very much. Questions? Okay. So I guess now we go to Q&A, and I think I can call on people. Do we need to do anything about, and I'll repeat questions. So yes, sir.
So Professor, thank you for coming, and your talk was instructive. I have a question, but I want to start with, I found your talk a little troubling in an academic institution. Troubling because it was largely one-sided, and you didn't present a counter view. Yeah. So I hope that would have happened. I'm I'm not suggesting that I disagree with your comments or that I agree with them, but I hope that we had been given the benefit of both sides of an argument. So your comment in the Trump era presupposes the president is to blame for what's happening in the United States of America. And the prevailing view in the media, both Canadian in the liberal press, but also in the conservative and liberal press in the United States, the prevailing view is that President Trump is responsible for the racism, President Trump is responsible for the sexism, President Trump is responsible for the sexual harassment. And what I would like to ask, on the opposite, so a counter view, isn't it possible that he, the president, is a catalyst for the positive things that are happening in America? I myself have been a victim of horrific things in my life. My friend can attest to it. But isn't it possible that President Trump is a catalyst for today Matt Lauer being fired? For yesterday Charlie Rose being terminated? For the other people that have committed these crimes? It didn't happen under the Bush administration. It didn't happen in the Clinton administration. President Clinton was himself a little, liberal-minded in terms of his approach to women. It didn't happen in the Carter administration or the Reagan administration. And if Trump is a bad man, and I'm not a Republican, and nor am I a liberal, but just to look at the opposite side, if Trump is a nasty man, should we not? Well, I've already asked one, but here's a second one. Please. The second question is shouldn't we see what Bush did in his administration in 8 years, gave us ISIS, gave us Al-Qaeda, and gave us the largest destabilization of a region that has been known to humanity outside of what happened to Jerusalem in 70 AD, as written by Montefiore. So those are my two questions. Isn't it possible there's some...
Okay. Well, and you asked, okay, well, let me try to...
And number 3, so isn't it possible there's some positive things coming out of this administration? Not out of the administration, but the presence of the administration, and to be clear, I'm neither a Republican nor Democrat. And 2, isn't it possible that America has actually seen worse and the situation is not quite as dire as some Republican Democrat columnists?
Can I get started? No, hold on. This is great. This is a good thing to have questions and to have, there were a couple other questions that you asked that are totally different from those other two. You asked a question about something about how Matt Lauer is attributable to Donald Trump, and I could not follow the logic on that. So that would, but let me try to answer a question that I actually can answer on the. Let me try to get started. There's a lot of other people. And I would just parenthetically address the thing you said at the beginning, which is I would say that the entire point of conversations like this is to allow somebody to be one-sided. There is no burden or requirement that you have to spend twice your time presenting the other side, or you all get to consider my point of view. That is academic freedom, and I would suspect that's one of the reasons that you have lectures like this. So you get your point of view, which you just expressed, which is terrific, and this is a debate. Now, on your second two questions, I would say yes. There certainly can be many good things coming out of this administration, and there certainly are many bad things that have happened throughout history, and I would tease out of the fact that you would ask those questions that there is, don't lampoon or caricature what I have said. I don't think I said that this is the worst moment in American history, and I don't think I said that there is nothing good that can come out of this administration. I would hope the president would succeed. I have said many times throughout this year, he has an opportunity in front of him. He has the opportunity right now to correct course, to spend the rest of his administration bolstering and basically paying heed to the norms and to the values that have gotten America as far as it has. There is, so, there is I'm not getting into a debate about what he's doing on regulation or on, there's a whole lot of domestic policy debates that are going to happen through this. My concern are the actions that the administration has undertaken that directly undermine core democratic pillars of our constitutional democracy, like religious toleration, like the separation of powers, like the freedom of the press, like the prohibition on political violence in pursuit of your political ends. And all those, there is just so much evidence, I can't see how anybody could question it, of them taking these actions and making these statements and really undermining democracy. And they can stop doing that. They have been stopped doing that from other branches of government and from a very powerful resistance movement. So I think that that's been healthy. But look, play by the rules. The rules have gotten American democracy over 200 centuries to this point. Just play by the rules. There's a lot of debates you can have. You don't need to threaten and bluster and undermine these constitutionalism itself. So that's how I would answer your question. Yes, ma'am. Hi.
I truly appreciate you coming today and talking to us about your position. And what I learned and didn't get from as much from the media is much more about what Charlottesville stands for today. So I wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on how the media represented the events in Charlottesville over the last couple months?
That's a really good question. Any citizen, much less any public official now, is really, we're all like fighting this uphill battle against really a horrible media culture. My parents are trained as journalists in the old school of like print journalism. My dad has a master's from the Medill School at Northwestern and was a reporter and then an editor for a long time. My mom has a master's from Columbia, and I was raised like caring about fact checking and caring about double sourcing things and old-fashioned things like that in journalism. And you have, and did anybody see the movie Network a long time ago? In Network, which was I think 1973, Network, which was a satire. Network, the plot of a satirical movie was that the entertainment division of a major network merges and takes over the news division. It was a satire. So what has happened today is that has happened. You have seen, if you watch, I was out for dinner recently with the bureau chief of CNN, who's a really nice guy, and so if he's, I don't mean to, I think CNN, they're all trying to do a lot of good work, but they are slipping into an entertainment where entertainment is the end rather than even a means, and we are all suffering with that. So you already had all the horrible trends. If it bleeds, it leads. The shortening time on news stories. The news stories used to be 3 minutes long. That was the average, I think, in local news. Somebody just told me with our local station it's a minute 20. So what can you communicate in a minute and 20, really? And then you have Twitter and the volatility of Twitter and the emotionalism of it, which the president and a lot of people around him are very conversant in and understand. So what happened in Charlottesville in the worst way was really tailored to create awful images for the city in that new ecosystem, right? That's bad. That frustrates me terribly. And I'm very worried that, that the Vice News, that one clip of the one guy with the tiki torch becomes this indelible image that is hard to displace in favor of what I spent 10 minutes telling you about, which is the real city that I live in. If you tomorrow got in a plane and flew down to Charlottesville, you would have an amazing time. You would see things that aren't wonderful because we're a complicated city with lots of problems like any other city, but it's an amazing, diverse, tolerant, wonderful, friendly place. So I am very frustrated by the media environment. I'm frustrated by how the alt-right plays it so intentionally. So Richard Spencer came back like, I think it was 5 or 6 weeks ago, and he did a flash mob at the park with the Lee statue where he and a group of people in this very secretive way, they didn't let anybody know in public. They didn't communicate it on social media. They did it all privately. I think there were about 35, and they very furtively parked a few cars and then marched up like 3 or 4 streets, filming themselves the whole way to go to Emancipation Park and to be filmed for like 10 minutes, doing chants with their tiki torches, solely for the purpose that they could stage it and have that video be on social media and be captured and race around the globe. So when you're really nimble and you know how to play, and then that got covered by everybody, and that's another image, all it really was 35 idiots, appearing for 10 minutes very furtively and very cowardly, I think, solely for the purpose of creating a spectacle for this new media landscape. So I wish, I hope that one of the things that comes out of all this is the media landscape itself, executives, reporters, journalists, learn to adopt a more disciplined and socially responsible ethos of all of their choices they're making. We're going to all have to do that with social media. I mean, social media, Facebook has only been doing this for a few years. So you're going to see new consumer habits that I hope are going to develop, and demands for deciding between fake news, for where the stuff is coming from. So the populace has a role to play in what we get also, and demand, but that should happen through media also, because it cannot stay this bad. Yep.
I don't know if you've read No Is Not Enough by Naomi Klein.
I've read about it, but I haven't read it.
She talks about shock politics and how your freedoms can be removed by a kind of shock and awe campaign that confounds everyone. And the only thing that kind of gets you past it is if you have a collective memory of recent attempts to do that you can draw on, that allows you to kind of to just say no to everything. Just say this, I'm not going to let the police state take over. I'm not going to let my freedoms be diminished. But in the case of Charlottesville, you have a local thing that may not cover the entire nation. So I'm not sure if that means that it's going to come up the way your optimism would suggest. Like just a common set of understanding of the past. Where my sense of the states is you have parallel versions of the past that live side by side that don't talk to each other. That's my question.
I think that's fair. I mean, I think that you have, you certainly have a base in American political life right now that is this hardcore supporter of Trumpism. And I would say that their version of history and of events is very different. That's okay. We've seen that before. I mean, you have different tracks, in our country's history. I mean, the real question is what prevails, is what becomes the dominant narrative in the reality. I haven't read the book. That's very interesting. But I do think that, I mean, this is why what happened in Virginia is so significant. This is why I didn't even get into something. There were like 600 rallies in support of Charlottesville in the 3 or 4 days after the 12th. I mean, the communications that I got around the country were just incredible. And those really matter. And I think the country was, I'm not being Pollyannish about it. I agree with you that the country is divided. But, I believe that was the moment that the alt-right fatally injured itself in terms of its viability as a mainstream political movement. I think it was the moment that the president committed one of his most grave self-inflicted wounds when he equivocated between the two sides. You saw that with the reaction. Steve Bannon was out of the White House. I mean, there were real things that happened as a result of this. So I'm not, again, there's no complacency, or the story's not ending, here in my telling, but I do think that it might have contributed to the consolidation of opinion that you're describing without having read the book. Yeah.
Just curious, what sort of changes do you think occurred in American culture that sort of allowed the population to become possibly more vulnerable to a demagogue to take power, and thus allow the actions to take place in Charlottesville?
That's a wonderful question. So the question was, what changes happened in American culture that were the precursors to a demagogue coming into power, and is that right? And what happened in Charlottesville? I think I went into some of them here with this deconsolidation scholarship, which is there is a lot contributing to, and this is happening across Western democracies. That's one of the things that they document. So this cynicism about political institutions, the lack of civic education, the remove from the world wars, which really did consolidate a lot of opinion around these alternative forms of government. I think that's, my grandfather, who was a Jeep mechanic for the Army in World War II, he had a very real sense of the alternatives that were offered, at that time in the stakes of democracy. A lot of people have talked about the fragmentation of our media environment. This is something I probably should have talked about in response to that question, which is when you have a lack of overlap between media environments and people narrowcast themselves and all they consume is, like, if you spend time only watching MSNBC or only watching Fox News, you're going to come away with such radically different takes on possibilities of government or politics, or democracy itself, that it's hard to see how people actually do what the system requires in our system of government, which is not a parliamentary system. And in a presidential system, you actually have to have the different factions work with one another. You have to. You have to be able to compromise and deliberate and come to some, one party doesn't just get total control of the government and get to pass its program. You have to be able to work with one another and accommodate and compromise. So I think the media is a large part of it. Gerrymandering is a huge part of it because the electeds only play to the far extreme, so the public doesn't witness compromise or working together or deliberation. So, but I think the coarsening of our culture is just a huge part of it. I don't know. If I'm not surprised when you learn that Trump was a major fan of the worldwide, not just wrestling, but the United Fight Club stuff. That is consistent with a vision of politics where it's might makes right, and it's basically force being a legitimate way to prevail. And then force becomes, then bullying is okay, and lampooning other people is okay, and name calling is okay, and emotional appeals are okay, and basically mob type, where you're really applauding for the strongest, not for the guy or the woman with the best argument or who persuades the crowd. You're just applauding strength. And that's will to power stuff. That's really bad. And that is incompatible with constitutional democracy, with deliberative democracy. So, it would take a much smarter person than me to sort of tease out all the different variables and what got us here, but there's a lot. So many hands. Yes, sir.
I'll confess to being one of the few Canadians who hasn't read your book. But your thesis that the people are the answer to demagogues, they are their own answer, makes sense to me. But as you also talked about, one of the tools of demagoguery is emotion and the appeal to emotion, and also the Unite the Right movement was an attempt to build enthusiasm amongst people on the right. What's seems to me, however, if the people are the answer, is we need a corresponding level of emotion and enthusiasm on the opposite side. And there seems to me to be a enthusiasm gap right now between folks on the progressive side versus folks on the right, especially the extreme right, where the level of enthusiasm is very high. And the, let's say, lack of enthusiasm on the progressive side, or at least the distance between the two seems to be significant. And it's not just an American problem. I think this was true of the Brexit vote. It's particularly an issue, I think, amongst millennials. Because enthusiasm, I think, as you alluded to, is not just about feeling passionately about something, but then acting on your passion, voting, volunteering, donating. It requires that action as well. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the enthusiasm gap.
So it's a great question, but I really would refer you to what just happened in Virginia. And everybody should read this New York Times Magazine article about Loudoun County. I think it was did anybody read that? It was it was 2 weeks ago. It documented exactly what you're describing. And then there was another article just now about Pod Save America, which is getting this massive listenership. And it was because the liberals had tried for a long time to do this parallel the right-wing, talk radio, and it didn't work. They did Air America and went bankrupt. And it was basically what they learned was that they were trying to mimic the enthusiasm producing things on the right by mimicking them in form. And instead, it needs to be something different. It's a different way of communicating that progressives, for whatever reason, like. But what is happening, Virginia and New Jersey are the only states that have elections after the year after the statewide elections after the presidential year. So we're always a barometer for what happened the prior year, and or canary in the coal mine, however you look at it. So, but everything you just said is, I agree. I had those same concerns. Is empirically rebutted by specific, many thousands of examples of organizational social enthusiasm on the left. That there were like hundreds of pop-up groups. The donations were massive. The phone calling was massive. The volunteering was massive. So it may be, and again, I'm not meaning to be Pollyannish. I might have selection bias. We don't know what's going to happen around other areas, but there, at least with this one instance, that is not the case. There actually is parallel enthusiasm right now, and it is because everybody's witnessed this profound offensive onslaught on real core values. That's like a whole different level than progressives going to, like the protests against the Iraq War, for instance. Or they talked in the article about when Stephen Colbert and Jon Stewart did this rally on the Mall in Washington in 2011, and like 235,000 people came, but they didn't direct them to do. I was there. It was like this kind of anodyne, nonpartisan thing, and there wasn't really a takeaway from it. Whereas the takeaways now are very clear. So I just would say that the story might be changing very significantly.
Sir, I want to thank you for bracing the cold and coming up here to talk to us. Before I ask my question, I want to commend you on tackling the racial issue in your town with the openness that you did. I think that's very healthy and not easy, I'm sure. The two key words in your lecture that I found very interesting were class and oligarchy. And I want to ask you, do you think that the real threat to democracy in America is not a lunatic fringe or a Cheeto Benito, but an entrenched oligarchy of Washington and New York whose policies are guiding endless wars of power.
Sorry, sorry.
That are bankrupting the country and dividing people, and that are creating a surveillance state that endangers free speech that you talked about and privacy that you talked about. Would you agree that those are really the key dangers to a democracy, and not a guy who's going to be out in 4 years, 3 years? or a lunatic fringe who do not represent the mainstream in your town and your state and your country?
Why do I feel like I'm being cross-examined? It sounds like you want me to agree that. No, I mean, I think that there are, I don't think it's an either-or proposition. I think I could be worried about both of those things. So if I can be worried about both of those things, I think that disrupts the premise of your question a little bit, which is that there must be one or the other. I think they're both concerning. I think that what's happening with the FCC right now and net neutrality is totally panic-inducing for the future of the country. I think that it is horrific. It's very dangerous. It's probably worse than a lot of people think in terms of what it could mean for media conglomeration, for privacy, for cyber security, I mean, who knows what could happen, because the way that the internet is taking over with the Internet of Things and our increasing dependence, if you have no regulatory claim with basic democratic principles that shape that landscape, and you don't see these as utilities, if you give that up, which is what this libertarian ethos that is happening purely administratively. This is just going to happen through a vote at the FCC if the courts don't stop it. That's very dangerous. So I think what you're saying, a lot of us are really alert to these dangers. I don't spend as much time thinking about them because I have to spend a lot of my time involved basically in local government issues right now, but my wife teaches in the media studies department at UVA, and they're very smart people who are working very hard on the issues of oligopoly and regulatory capture and privacy that you're talking about. And I think that I'm hoping that the real danger, if you talk about the dangers going to the counter argument to what picture I painted is, what if the left in America, they're very focused on an election, they've been very focused on certain things, but what if they're so drawn into XYZ controversies about this tweet or that tweet and the way that cable news, and meanwhile, this awful shiny object is really what but there's this extraordinary regulatory change that's happening right back here, and the progressive engine is not really focused on the hard work to stop the FCC and to support the court actions from privatizing and the entire way that we communicate now. That would be really dangerous, just like what's happening with this awful tax bill where it's being rammed through, and you really need the entire apparatus of activism engaged. Now I'm speaking in a more, this is my progressive policy hat. You can make other arguments if you just disagree on policy grounds. I'm not talking so much about authoritarianism here. I mean, you could make an argument. These are just policy differences, but I don't like the way that these things are being rammed through and taking advantage of the ways that we're being distracted and manipulated away from serious policy matters. Yes.
So the media is basically saying that Bernie Sanders is basically the next person that they want to pick for the Democratic nomination. I'm just curious what you think is the alternative to Trump.
Well, I haven't. I'll tell you a story. I was actually asked to come up to brief Senator Sanders himself personally earlier this year on my Demagogue book. It was like fascinating. I drove up to DC, and his foreign policy advisor is an old friend of mine who had read the. I mean, it's really funny. It's like who had read the book and who knew about and he did. And I spent like half an hour with him just talking about demagogues, and there were a couple of staffers there, and they did. It was before he did a major speech. I think it was at the Atlanta Council on Foreign Relations, it was about authoritarianism, and it was this big speech that he was doing. So they wanted, I'm very impressed with him. I mean, I think I thought, considering where the ideas he was introducing, the substantiveness and the control and the way that he was able to explain things and the way that he was able to connect with people, it was very exciting and it was very new in American politics, certainly in the Democratic Party, where centrism has sort of been the, what people have, recently done a lot. I don't think there's any way of, I haven't endorsed anybody, and I don't know. I mean, there's going to be a lot of candidates, I think. And I think that there will be a lot of options. And I'm not going to say all the names here, but I would expect there will be 5 or 6 serious candidates that will, like Eric Garcetti in LA, who's a mayor, is making noise about running, and he's young, and he would bring in this mayoral experience. I wouldn't be surprised if Terry McAuliffe, the governor of Virginia, runs, and he'll bring in this, economic reform, good government, and actually some social justice work. And then I don't know if Elizabeth Warren goes, or all these other, there's a lot of very strong public figures out there. Joe Biden, who knows? So I think it'll be really exciting for us because we have a lot of talent. We have a lot of different arguments that people can make against what they're seeing. You have a very engaged base, which is really, awake about all this. So I don't know. It'll be very interesting to see what happens with him. Yep.
Okay, this is maybe more of a statement than a question. I think, don't presuppose what I'm going to say. Because,
let him speak.
okay,
Don't
I
behave
think
like
that
children.
the fact that Trump is showman as a president is one of the most unfortunate things that I can recall in my lifetime. I think that part of that is because of the American political system, the fact that Hillary Clinton and Trump were the best that America put forward, alienated, and there was a lack of engagement of younger people. Many countries in the world, including Canada, have much younger leaders. And part of the problem is the cost to get involved in politics. I think there's a structural problem as well.
I agree. In the back.
Two things. One thing, talking about the progressiveness of Charlottesville, how much of that is because the University of Virginia is in Charlottesville and influences of the city? And what about those other 150,000 people that are really part of that Charlottesville, population? How much do they influence, and are they of the same mind, the same progressive mind as I would say, the University of Virginia people are? The second thing is concerning Trump. I think that what he has done, and you've been talking about people taking action, he's certainly done that. People on both the left and right are taking action everywhere. So whether that's his main focus is to get people involved, it certainly happened.
Well, I'll just address the first part. So I think that the university plays a huge role in the progressivism of the city. It's interesting. You have universities can differ themselves. You have conservative university towns in Virginia. So where Liberty University is near Lynchburg is a conservative town. It's a conservative population. You have, so it's not predestined to be liberal, but for whatever reason, the population of that university, in the way that it relates to the town, is increasingly politically liberal over the years. Charlottesville is really liberal. Charlottesville is like 85% Democratic, voted for Bernie Sanders, as I said. The county that surrounds us, when John Kerry ran for president, that you saw a really stark divide. Cities voted for the Democrat and counties voted for, that was George Bush, right? So so you had a county-city divide around America. There were only a handful of counties that voted for John Kerry, who was a Democrat, and Albemarle County was one of them. So that the county has, over recent years, also become increasingly Democratic as a result of the encroachment of the university population, because, ironically, Charlottesville is becoming more expensive. A lot more people live 5 miles out in the surrounding counties, so the counties become more Democratic. And what happened 2 years ago, for the first time in history, was all 6 members of the Albemarle County Board of Supervisors are Democrats. So previously they had Republican members. So, but they have a more moderate, they have more moderate brand of politics there, and they also have a much smaller minority population. So they generally don't address or are not forced to deal with the same issues of social equity, race, class that we've been discussing here in the county nearly as much as the city has. And the city has, you know, a 19% black population. They have a lot of historic bad things that happen within the city of Charlottesville. So I think that you do see a divide between the county and the city. But the county is increasingly more aligned with the city. On the second one, that sounded like a keen observation. So, yep.
So perhaps something to challenge your optimism, and I would put to you the story of Plato, Socrates, himself.
The story of what?
Plato,
oh.
philosopher, actually went to Syracuse to try to improve the tyrant there, by the name of Dion, but he did not succeed. In a way, you could say that Plato was optimistic as a philosopher to imbue a tyrant, a demagogue, with knowledge and virtue. But then he had to go away. And the same story applies to Martin Heidegger, who was a member of the Nazi party. Right? One quip from one of his university colleagues when he returned to university was, so how was it in Syracuse after the war? Right? So your point of view is perhaps not something like this, but you rely more on the people, right? The American people being that ground that will prevent a demagogue from taking root. Right? So how would you differentiate the two? Let's say there's 35% of people who continually are solid in their support of Trumpism, and the rest are perhaps, could be made into fallow ground for demagoguery to take root. So the perspective is, do you want to improve the 35%, in which case, Plato and Heidegger have failed on, or what specific strategies are there available to you as an American people, perhaps within your own particular framework of your federalism, to prevent this following of this ground for the government to take root? The Federalist Papers, from what I could remember, had two primary concerns. One being, like you said, the prevention of tyranny. The other also is foreign influence. And that may have to do a lot with Great Britain at that time. But in current situation in the United States, there is this whole issue of Russian involvement in the election or campaign. But that's on the negative aspect of it. What about the...
All right, you've been asked, can I...
Foreign involvement of countries like Canada, is that still like a taboo thing in American democracy?
Okay, it's a very thoughtful question, and I wanted to get, I think to answer it in full might take a couple of hours. So let me just talk about Plato. So Plato is not support at all for my sense of optimism for when I talked about how you either see history as flat or as optimism being achievable. Plato was the most dark on democracy or in the people's ability to achieve self-salvation through democracy. Plato had, probably among the most harsh, pessimistic critiques we have of the people's ability to self-govern. I write extensively about it. I mean, he watched, the mob in Athens assassinate Socrates. He He thought that democracy was a perverse form of rule. He wrote The Republic to basically design a way to use eugenics and acculturation over generations to basically render regular people docile, pawns in a very elaborate apparatus where you could only get power by being, graduated up through levels of selection. So he just had no use for democracy and didn't believe that the people could achieve an optimistic arc of history through self-governance. So that was his political philosophy. Karl Popper wrote about him, he was an authoritarian, essentially. So I disagree with that point of view. I disagree with his perspective on the people's ability to achieve self-governance based on what you would describe as a self-fulfilling optimism that depends on agency. So what is inside the American experiment, and it is everywhere, over what the founding fathers, like in my Madison book, I go over the debate that James Madison had with Patrick Henry about the Constitution in the ratifying convention in Richmond in 1788, was basically about this. It was about, could we trust the people to self-fulfill, to build a political culture where they would take action on a daily basis to achieve these principles that weren't just going to achieve themselves on their own. So he used the word confidence in this one debate they had 4 times in this one passage where he said this system will depend on confidence. We have to have confidence. But he was saying everybody is going to have to actually act to breathe life in the democracy. And that's what de Tocqueville documented 50 years later. And that is what constitutionalism is. But it is not self-fulfilling. It doesn't just happen on its own. So, my speaking in the way that I do here, I see this as part of that. I mean, this is in a different country, but I see it as a part of that process. And it really does depend on this fundamental itch that drives one to act and to protest and to take part and to write letters to the editor. I mean, I go through a million different forms of action, but the opposite of that is what happened in pre-Nazi Germany, where you had isolation and alienation and complacency and cynicism, and all say, well, here's will to power. I'm just, a majority of us are going to hand ourselves over to it, like Heidegger did. That is not what you're seeing in the United States right now. Thank God. It's really important that we're not seeing that. But there are very concerning signs that are cause for grave alarm, like in this deconsolidation literature. So, that's how I would answer that part of your very smart question. Yeah. Okay, one more. Okay. Yep. You.
Thank you for your remarks. What was it like to be a community leader through something so traumatic? And for you as a person, did you have self-doubt? How did you view your own role? Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. It was very hard. We've got there are some problems where there really is no good answer, and that's frustrating for type A lawyers who are trained in trying to reason through to answers. And I generally try to believe that there's a solution for a lot of things. And I remember before the 12th, like a few weeks before, and I got very involved in this in a way that the office of mayor in Charlottesville was actually not designed for. And that's a whole other set of issues. But you're really the chair of the board that has this very specific set of roles in a city manager form of government. That's the way that the office is designed. So the police don't report to me. The prosecutor doesn't report to me. You don't have an operational role in a lot of what people think government does. You do have a policy role, you have a budget role, the city manager works for you. So there are ways of kind of navigating a solution, but it is particularly challenging in an emergency situation or one where people are frightened. So I've talked to another mayor who's a mayor of a town in Indiana who I've been friends with for a long time, I was getting advice from all different mayors and lots of people. And he said, "You're sailing into the windstorm." And it was something I've thought about ever since then, because this idea that just to kind of, there was a windstorm coming and we were heading into it. And the question about how to get out of it intact with no real solution to the storm itself, because these people were coming and you couldn't really stop them from coming. You try to change things about it. And then you saw what happened with the story. So it was very difficult. It's difficult. One of the roles that you have in public life with a traumatic event is to try and rally people and try and focus them on what the good is, and that is a necessity. That's not like the whole picture. There's always a lot to be depressed about or frightened about, but I saw part of my role as in the days and weeks afterward of really trying to unify and move forward. Some people didn't want to hear that. They thought that, you know, that that we should be mourning and still focusing on the hurt part that comes before the healing. And that's an almost impossible line to tread well. And I found it very difficult. We were subjected to, you know, personal threats and to a level of vitriol that is just anybody in public life. You have to have a really thick skin now, but it's pretty intense with social media. I mean, we had, you know, a meeting with the FBI, the Anti-Defamation League. It opened up a file on me. They had 800 cases of this, you know, this kind of vile anti-Semitic stuff. We didn't let our twin 3-year-old boys sleep in our house the night before the rally. We trucked them over and just had them sleep at a friend's house because you didn't really know if there's some madman. So that level of stress and of, you know, I mean, I was waking up at 4 a.m. for weeks on end, kind of racking my brain about what could you do with this windstorm, and we, you know, I think a lot of us were. So it's very challenging to sort of, and especially in a system where the position in the government itself has limited powers. You can't just snap your fingers and say, hey, you go do. It has to navigate through policy and through budget and through the city manager relationship. So that it was very challenging. So, you know, that's an honest answer, but it's also, you know, in a way, I mean, there really was this, you know, the city of Charlottesville itself has stood up and really processed a lot of this it's very raw and it's a very angry time, but it's been a real privilege to be there with everybody and to learn from everybody. Sometimes I'm certainly the target of a lot of anger. That has happened, absolutely. But, you know, somebody's got to do it. So you'd rather have good people in these positions, and I'm a good person, so it's been a real privilege to try. Is that it?